In your life group today, I hope you'll walk down memory lane and the things that we've learned about David and just go over them and talk about them. It's been a long journey. I would say it's been a good one. We began this study of David on that first Sunday in 2018, so it's time to put it to rest as we put David to rest today. But go back over his life and remember him today, the best about him and the worst, and learn some lessons, again, of how you can be better because you've come to know something about this man named David. Next week, we'll begin a brand new sermon series on Paul's letter to the Ephesians, so if you want to read ahead in the first chapter, please do that. That would be wonderful. If you remember from last week what the dying King David asked of his son, then you'll know why Solomon acted like he did in the following chapters. In 1 Kings 1, Solomon is made king, and he deals kindly with his half-brother Adonijah, who has tried to take the throne on his own. He sends him back home in peace. In chapter 2, though, when his brother, that same one, boldly asks for Abishag, that's David's young concubine, to become his wife now, which was surely offensive to Solomon and the memory of David, Solomon calls for his death. Abiathar, the priest, he's allowed to live because of what he did for the ark of God, the place of God. But Joab, who killed the innocent without mercy, if you remember those stories, is finally killed even while he clings to the horns of the altar of God. And do you remember Shimei? David let him live even as he threw stones and curses at him. He let him live. Even Solomon let him live, but with restriction. He must never leave the city, because the day he leaves the city, that is the day he would die. And that works for a while, for a time. There's that one day when he thoughtlessly runs out of the city after some of his runaway slaves, gets them, brings them back. It's told to Solomon, and then he is killed just as it was stated that he would be. And with that, Solomon's troublemakers gone, out of the way, and his kingdom then is well established, and his story continues, and it's a great story, even some would say greater than David's, but we won't follow it from here. Our focus has been on David, and this is where we'll leave him right here. Our story ends here. Just before this, as it says in 1 Kings 1:10, then David rested with his ancestors and was buried in the city of David. I want to go to 1 Chronicles 29 and wrap up our study as the chronicler does his own summation of the end of David's life, which is really just an echo of what we've already heard. And it is. It's just a repeating. As he repeats what 1 Kings said, David, son of Jesse, king over all Israel. He ruled over Israel 40 years, 7 years in Hebron, 33 in Jerusalem. And then it says he died at a good old age, having enjoyed long life, wealth, and honor, and his son Solomon succeeded him as king. In order to establish Solomon as king, they sacrificed animals, more than you could probably imagine seeing killed. 1,000 bulls, 1,000 rams, 1,000 lambs. Can you imagine just those 3,000 animals heaped up? Can you imagine the amount of blood spilling there, the amount of dead animal carcasses and the smell of burning flesh on the altar? All of that was to honor the Lord, and there were more honor offerings made, and it was a big celebration. It says, they ate and drank with great joy in the presence of the Lord, and Solomon was anointed for a second time, this one a more public anointing, if you remember the first one that was almost happening very quickly and over there, but everyone there pledged their loyalty to him, and that's how Solomon's story begins. But just before 1 Chronicles ends, just before David's death, it wraps up with the preparations of the temple that his son would actually accomplish building it. And in that transition between the last big thing David did and when he died, the collector of history here gives this prayer of David, this praise, as he also says goodbye to the man. And I know we've been over this, but it's good. So as we bid this great man farewell, listen one more time to this prayer and praise that he has given. It's recorded in 1 Chronicles 29. It's already been repeated, and we already read it this morning. But one more time, because it's good. Praise be to you, Lord, the God of our father Israel, from everlasting to everlasting. Yours, Lord, is the greatness and the power and the glory and the majesty and the splendor. For everything in heaven and on earth is yours. Yours, Lord, is the kingdom. You are exalted as head over all. Wealth and honor come from you. You are the ruler of all things. In your hands are strength and power to exalt and give strength to all. Now, our God, we give you thanks and praise your glorious name. David, one more time, the great king, points to the one who has the real greatness and real power. David, the royal one, nods to the one who has true glory and majesty and splendor. David, the one who conquered his enemies with strength and power, who ruled the kingdom well, tips his crown to the greatest ruler of all, as exalted over all with all wealth and honor and strength and power, and to the one who generously shared it all with him in the first place. David, when given one more chance, takes it to say one more time, now, our God, we give you thanks and praise your glorious name. And he asks out loud, and I know we've been through it, but he says, and who am I? One more time, who am I? And who are these people? My people. And what an honor just to give generously as this. It's amazing because he turns this privilege of receiving into the privilege of giving. And he acknowledges everything comes from you, and we have given you only what already has come from your hand. And he says, and it all belongs to you. It all belongs to you. And I just wonder one more time if that's what you thought this morning as you put something in the plate. Is that when you go home today, is that how you look at your car and your house and your clothes and your stuff and your money and your family and everything you have? This isn't mine, Lord. You know it. This isn't mine. It's yours. You gave it to me. You let me have the honor and the privilege of having it, but it's not really mine. So I give it back to you because it's already yours. And if I use it, it's yours. And if I give it, it's yours because all of the glory, Lord, goes to you. What an example of generosity. What an example of faithfulness. What an example of humility. What an example of godliness. What an example of gratitude. So this is where we reminisce about David. He's gone the way of all of mankind. He's put into the grave now. He's dead. He's buried. His life is over on earth. Nobody will see him here again. We're left to consider what he did and what he was like and what we can learn. And first of all, I think some of the things that may have bothered you through this study is some of the bad things he has done. Some of the bad things he has done. There's a man who wrote a book, and his name is Bader, Joel S. Baden. He's a Boston native who's now an associate professor at Yale Divinity School, and he comes up with who David is. And in describing him, he uses the words like he was a power-hungry outlaw, a wife stealer, a murderer, a traitor, and a usurper. And he says, David was a successful monarch, and I have agreed so far to most of the things he says, but then he says, but he was a vile human being. And I could not disagree more. All of us are truly a mixed bag of blessings and cursings. All of us have within us some real good and some real bad, and there's no hiding it. There is none who I think would have no good in them. None. Maybe you would disagree, but almost everybody you find, even at their worst, the vilest among us, would have something good. It was curious to find out in People magazine that Ted Bundy actually did something good in his earlier days. I don't know if you know the name Ted Bundy. I don't know how you could miss it. Self-confessed killer of at least 30 women in 7 states. The number, those who interviewed him said it could have been double or higher, maybe. He never owned up to more than 30 because he died in the electric chair in Florida, January 24th, 1989 at 7:16 in the morning, and you may remember that. But even once he, did you know this, helped apprehend a man who had just stolen a purse from a woman. Good old Ted Bundy, helping a woman out and then going on to slaughter so many. If a serial killer can do something good, then a godly man can do something evil. And I think you have to call it what it is. Even in the life of David, so much good in one man, so many characteristics we want to admire and duplicate, so many reasons to speak of him as this man after God's own heart. But don't skirt over the bad parts. Don't be embarrassed. It's true. There are times when he acted sinfully and selfishly, and I think surprisingly. But don't make excuses for him. Don't act like it didn't happen. It did. But it sure made him human for us, I think. And for me, for one, to see my own failings and sins in the life of that man has helped me be better. What a man. At the end of his life, I think most anybody could have seen what he became, but how many could have seen it when he was young? Kirsch writes, David may start out as a lad who tends his father's sheep in a country backwater, but he ends up as the king of Israel, the conqueror of an empire that stretches from the outskirts of Egypt to the far Euphrates. In life, he is praised as the king whom God selected to reign on earth, and in death, he is transfigured into a king who will reign on high. David becomes a shimmering theological symbol, a precursor and direct ancestor of the Messiah whom God will send to redeem a sinful and suffering humanity. At the end of the story now, as we put David into the tomb, he was one great man. Some could say and argue that one of the greatest of all time. But with all of the good in him, please understand he was not perfect. No one has ever been perfect save one. David was a great king, maybe one of the greatest, but he was not the king. Only one is the great King of Kings and Lord of Lords. In all of David's goodness, he was not only good, he was good in many ways, but he wasn't truly good in every way as only God is. David in all of his splendor was not as majestic as this one we speak about. And when David could not save himself, and anybody who wishes to believe in him will be sorely disappointed, we look now at the one who ended up saving David, the one who can save every man and woman and child. It is the Savior of the world. So when we come to this point, we may be encouraged by David, inspired by him, desiring to be more like him. But the hero of the story, and I'll say it every time, it is the Lord God Almighty. It is Jesus, his Son. It is the Spirit that he freely gives to those who are his. He's the one who made David. He's the one who put him in his place. He gave him the crown and the throne and the power and the majesty. And in all the blessings he gave, one of the greatest honors he could have given was that through his lineage, the Redeemer of mankind would come. So David then, born in Bethlehem, but he has one come through him, born in Bethlehem, who will be so much greater. David, the original king of the Jews, would have one come through him who would be killed for being the greater king of the Jews. David reigned well, but the one who would come from him would wear a crown that would never fade. He would be seated on a throne that would last forever and reign over heaven and on earth, over every creature, forever and ever. Of course, we speak of Jesus, and we always love to speak of Jesus, and we'll never tire of speaking of Jesus, because when Jesus comes on the scene, even the inspired writers connect the dots and reach back to the Old Covenant and establish his identity that started with David. Matthew begins his gospel account stating these words, "This is the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David." And when Jesus spoke to the crowds in Luke 11, he recognized himself, telling them who he is in relation to the great kings of the past. If David was great and Solomon was greater than David, it is Jesus who says in verse 31, and now something or someone is here that is greater than Solomon. We can say how Jesus came after David, but the truth of the Scriptures is Jesus was and is before David was ever born. David came from Jesus before Jesus came from David. And Jesus fulfilled the prophecies spoken about David and his heirs. So Jesus is the one who is the fulfiller of the promises in the first place. He is the one who did what David could not do. He lived and he died to save people. If David could do that with a sword, it would take Jesus doing his with a cross and an empty tomb. He lived and died and lived again, raised from the dead, which gives hope to all people who will eventually end up in their own tomb. So when Peter preaches at Pisidian Antioch, his words are recorded in Acts 13, he's making a point about Jesus, but reaching back to David. So here are his words. Now when David had served God's purposes in his own generation, he fell asleep. He was buried with his ancestors, and his body decayed. His point is that Jesus did not decay in his grave, but God raised him up. Still, I love the line, David served God in his own generation. Hey, I could ask right here, what about you? No need to talk much about David's generation or the apostles' generation or your parents' generation. What about you? Could that be said of you today? That you served God's purpose in your own generation today? I don't know what has influenced you most about David. It could be, there's a good likelihood, something that might have influenced you most from David might have been from his pen. Because so many of the Psalms are still recorded for us, and the legacy that David left us, just in the songs of Israel, which are the Psalms of the church. And even I think people who don't know David or much about him, even out there, could maybe have heard some words like this. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. The Lord is my light and my salvation, whom shall I fear? I lift up my eyes to the hills, and where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. And who can forget the 23rd Psalm? One more time, this past week, from this pulpit, it was read because a family wanted it read. And so many families go back to this psalm, the Psalm of David, to give them hope and comfort at a time like that. You remember it? Could you quote it? The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing, or I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores or refreshes my soul. He guides me along the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. And even if I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup runs over. Surely your goodness and love or mercy will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. What have you learned about David? What could you learn from David? I liked Rabbi Posner, who gave 15 life lessons from King David on Chabad.org. I won't give you all 15, but here's a good sampling, and hopefully you could be challenged by these. Maybe you remember these stories if you've been in here. Number 13, be a loyal friend. When friends are hard to come by, David cherishes the ones he have, and sometimes they're few. Take Jonathan, for example, the best friend maybe he ever had, but not only him, others who stepped in and out of his life at different times, and David always responds to those who treat him with great kindness, with great kindness. Number 10, don't try to undo the past. When David couldn't be king, even when he was anointed. When he sinned with Bathsheba and her husband. She's pregnant, he's dead. When his young son dies because of his own fault, even as he prays for God's mercy. When he could not build the temple, even when it was his one desire at the end of his life. David kept moving forward. He didn't live in the past. He didn't regret what had already happened. He continued walking in grace to face the next day and the next challenge. Number 9, accept rebuke. When you're confronted with your sin, like David was with Nathan, listen. Do the right thing. If you did it, confess it. If you messed up, own it. If you're rebuked for it, take it. If you're given a second chance to make things right, no matter how royally you failed, do it. If you sinned, be the man or be the woman. Accept your responsibility in it. Number 7, never forget about God. No matter how bad it gets, no matter how the enemy wants to destroy you, no matter how long you run for your life, no matter if it looks hopeless and you feel helpless and there is no way this could possibly work out, remember God. And even when God himself seems far away or does not seem to answer your prayers or does not allow you to do what you believe is best, still stay close to him. Trust God. Number 5, take the high road. Even if you can get revenge, don't. Even when you could take matters into your own hands and settle the score, don't. Even when you think you might want to get back at your enemy and your enemy may be among your people, don't. Even when you can do what everybody else would say is okay to do and nobody would blame you for doing it, don't. Do the right thing every single time. Number 4, it's okay to be emotional. David didn't mind at all pouring out his heart before the Lord in the Psalms. He didn't mind weeping uncontrollably for his own dead sons or fessing up about his own humanity and sinfulness. David was raw and he was real, and his heart lives on in his Psalms for all to see in the story and feel with him. Number 2, just because no one did it before you doesn't mean it cannot be done. It's where David makes a name for himself, when everybody learns his reputation, when nobody could beat Goliath. Nobody even tried to stand up against the giant. Everybody in the Israelite army sat on their hands, paralyzed by fear, including the king named Saul, and David assumes God can do it, and he would do it through him. And no matter how many people thought he was nuts, David walked out on that field and did what nobody thought could be done, trusting God the whole time. And that galvanized his reputation and his legend and his faith in God. And the number 1 lesson from the very first time we see David in the Scriptures, it's the lesson that the prophet Samuel learned that you should never forget. Never judge anyone by their appearance. God can take anyone of any age, in any circumstance, at any time, with any limitation and any disadvantage, and anoint them with greatness and shape them for his purpose and use them for his glory. Don't doubt that God can. And please don't count yourself out, because he may be doing it right now as I speak with you. But those are some lessons from some other folks. What lesson will you learn? What will you take home with you? How will you be different because you have spent just a little time in the Scriptures with David? And how could you be possibly labeled as, described as, explained as a man or a woman after God's own heart? And wouldn't that be something if people said that of you? A great place to start is right here and right now. Start with faith. Start with changing your ways and changing your heart and changing your mind and changing your life. Turning your back on your sinful old ways and changing to become something new in Christ, in his blood. in baptism and live your life with passion and purpose in faithfulness to Him, so that for you, at the end of your life, you could be followed by goodness and mercy every day that you live and continue on to dwell in the house of the Lord forever. What about you? What do you need from us? Let's stand and sing. Come if you need to.
Search me and try me, Master, today. Whiter than snow, Lord, wash me just now, as in thy presence humbly I bow.